Besley, and until very recently, I was the president of the Royal Economic Society. My main role today is to welcome you all to this year's Royal Economic Society annual lecture, which since 2001 has been a very significant event in the annual calendar of the Society. And we're grateful to all of you for making the journey to be here today. The lecture affords an opportunity for you to get a window on the work of an internationally renowned economist. And our hope is that many of you will be inspired to take your study of economics further by listening. We're delighted this year to be back holding the lecture in person, and we're extremely grateful to the University of Reading for hosting it. Please note that the lecture is being recorded, that you'll not be visible on camera, just the backs of your heads. I'm now delighted to introduce and welcome today's lecturer. Jagjit Chadha is Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. He was educated at UCL and LSE. He's taught at Cambridge, the University of Kent and Southampton. Some of you may recognise him from the TV show University Challenge, where he recently represented the alumni of LSE. Not very successfully, actually. Jagjit is one of the UK's foremost macroeconomists. He's been an advisor to Her Majesty's Treasury and the Parliamentary Select Committee of the House of Commons. In 2021, he was awarded an OBE for services to economics and economic policy. I can reveal to you that he stands today in front of you a very relieved man, given that Leeds United just managed to stay up on the last day of the Premier League season. His lecture today draws on his expertise on monetary policy and is extremely topical, given that we're looking at a much less benign outlook for inflation than we've had in recent years. It's titled Money Minders, the Parables, Trade-off and Lags of Central Banking, and for the discerning, there are copies of his book just to the right on the stage. Jagjit, we all appreciate your time. You've taken the time to give us this lecture today, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I'm incredibly grateful to Royal Economic Society for asking me to be the annual public lecturer for 2022. I've been a member of the Society for longer than any of you have been alive, since the early 90s, and I never would have thought I would be asked to give the annual public lecture. I'm also very grateful to the most recent past president of the Society, Tim Besley, for asking me to give this lecture. And I should say his work is a set of papers from which I've learned much over the years, and over the last few years I've enjoyed all our conversations about economics. It's been a time in which we've learnt a lot about the state of the economy, the role of government within it, and the role of institutions. And I hope today to go through some of those things with a specific focus on central banking. But I want you all to understand that these are often general principles that can be applied to any area of policy making, or indeed decision theory. And that's the great thing about economics. It can be applied very generally to lots of things, and providing we put another shilling in the meter, I'll try to continue with the lecture. I'm not sure what happened there, but anyway, we'll see what goes on. And I also just want to say I'm very grateful to the Department of Economics here at Reading for hosting me over the last day or so. It's been a lovely occasion to come back here again. I was saying to people, I was last year, I think in the late 1980s, playing a cricket match on the lawn out there, and it's good to see that it's been well maintained in the interim period. So thank you very much, James Reed and the department for looking after me. So let's go on to the topic in hand and see if I can work this thing. It looks like I can. And I'm going to talk about some issues that I've been wrestling with as an academic economist and also as a practitioner over the last 25 or so years. And I wanted to see if I could go through them with you as well this afternoon in a way that would allow you to move on and think about what they mean as you think about the world, your contribution to it, and the way you want the institutions to work their way through. That's something I've been occupied in my career. And as I get to perhaps the final third of it or whatever, it's very important that we pass the baton on to the next generation. Indeed, I went to a similar lecture when I was 18, given by Richard Lipsey, who wrote a very famous book that we all did as A-level students back then called Positive Economics. And it was a wonderful lecture describing all the different things that he was able to do in his career. And I would think it had a not insignificant impact on my interest in economic policy, which fortunately I've been able to pursue with the support of the Royal Economic Society and people like Tim, and I should say many, many others. If you want a list of the others, they're all mentioned at the beginning of my book. There's a ridiculously large number of people who've helped me along. But that's also an important part of learning, is to recognise that you're actually being supported in your learning by other people who are interested in what you do. It's not always your innate understanding of things. It's often the things you don't understand that then allow you to draw some conclusions and move on. So I'm going to talk about economics. And as we all know, there are three types of economists. Those who can count and those who can't. I'll leave you to draw at the end of this conversation which one I am, but we'll see how we get on as we go through this lecture today. What I'm going to tell you is a story about central banking and the institution of the Monetary Policy Committee and operational independence as it is practiced by the Bank of England at present. Indeed, Tim himself was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee for three years and may have some insights as well when it comes to questioning later on. But what I want to do is go through the story, which is, to me, an incredibly interesting story. I tried to describe it as a dull story in conversation with Chris Giles, who's the editor of the FT the other day, and he kind of shouted at me for saying, never call what you do dull. He said it would never get through the editors. But I'm kind of freer to sort of say, I sometimes wonder how interesting this is. But what was really impressive this morning is that for those of you who came to talk about monetary policy or think about it in the session we had, clearly the level of interest that you have in this and the level of understanding, it was remarkably high. I was relieved. Actually, some of us sit around and we think maybe this concern with price stability is anachronistic. Perhaps the next generation don't care about price stability. Perhaps all they care about is the price of the season ticket at their football club. That doesn't necessarily mean it's something consistent with price stability. But it was clear to me that those of you who came to that session understood the value of it and also understood what needed to be done to try and achieve it. So that was incredibly reassuring, because I can tell you now, when I was 18, I wouldn't have had a clue. So there is some sense in which we are improving this area. But the story I want to tell is that when we're thinking about a monetary policy, whether we go back to 14th century Venice, 17th or 18th century Holland, or 18th or 19th century England, a large part of it was about simple standards, monetary standards, a gold standard or a silver standard. It wasn't something that anyone thought that could be controlled. It's just the way it was. And I think that reflected a deeper philosophical attitude to what society was for people. As it was famously written by Hobbes, life was nasty, brutish, and short. There's not any time necessary to change the conditions under which you were living or likely to live. Therefore, these things just came down to you as something that just the way it was. And that is one way to think about the monetary standards that we had until well into the 20th century. This was a very long period in which monetary policy was itself simply about achieving a certain price level, which is a certain value of sterling in terms of a certain quantity of gold. That's all it was. Maintaining the value of sterling in terms of gold alone. And it persisted for a very long time because probably nobody had really worked out there was a better way of doing things, or that it didn't matter. And I'll come to why it didn't matter in a minute. But then over the course of the 20th century, with democratization, the need and the requirement for people to do better, indeed that very requirement to do better is encapsulated in the mid-20th century push towards better economic policy. Beveridge, one of the founders of the National Institute in 1938, was very clear about that in his famous white paper and his demand for full employment. We should do better for the people who are living in a democracy. Can we use scientific tools or economic policy to make their lives better than they would otherwise be? And this idea is being applied to monetary policy, and we'll kind of understand why in a minute. But as ever, nemesis awaits hubris, that we could end up trying to do too much. We could try to end up fine-tuning an economy, imagining that we have more information at our disposal than we actually have. And the danger then is, if we think we have more information than we have, more understanding of the economy, better tools than we have at our disposal, we may find that we're actually adding to economic volatility rather than attenuating economic volatility. And this, I think, is very much the lesson of the 2 or 3 decades after World War II, where we understood that, yes, we want to do better through demand management, but to understand there was a limit to what could be done. And there's a lot of work in that period trying to understand what been known as the stop-go cycle or the boom-bust cycle, where policy wasn't necessarily stabilizing the economic cycle, and if anything, may have been adding to it. Those ideas then led to something that became popular some 25 or so years ago, which is the science of monetary policy. That's to simplify what monetary policy is about, write down a simple rule, limit its ambition to something like price stability, and work out some operating procedures over bank rate or interest rates, the instrument of monetary policy, in order to hit a single well-defined target. Within that, somewhere, that target had to be something that there was a social consensus about, something about which people thought this is the right thing to do. No point in writing down a target when people want something else to be pursued. Then we're failing in the democratic mandate. The question then is it sufficient for politicians to be asked to do it, or do politicians have to simply set the target and then allow the experts to get on with it? That's essentially where we ended up in around 1997 with the adoption in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. But then the question was, and for those of you who are kind of interested in engineering, this question, how do we over-engineer the problem? How we simplified it so much that we were missing some of the really important impulses in the economy? Were we so focused on a very narrow definition of price stability, which came from what we call the real economy? Real economy is the actions of firms, labour markets, that we were missing some of the action that was really important off stage, like a Greek tragedy. That over-engineering, oversimplification may have meant in the period leading up to the great financial crisis, we were not understanding the impulses that were perturbating the economy from the financial sector. And it could be our models were not coordinating properly or understanding fully the impulses that were coming off stage, because we were concerned with the real economy rather than what was going on there. And if that's the case, the question is where next? What did we do in response to that? And how do we get back to a world in which it's much simpler? Because one of the things we've seen, unfortunately, in the last decade is a call, as the central banks have often been called, the only game in town, for them to take on more and more responsibilities. Can central banks help with income distribution? Can central banks help with income inequality, wealth inequality? Can they help with the net zero ambition? Now, all of these things are very important. But the question for a central bank is, should that be their primary or even secondary job? Because what we'll learn in a minute is if we give someone more than one objective, and we don't give them enough instruments to match those objectives, they will have to face some trade-offs because they can't hit all those objectives. And so what we're asking, if we ask central banks to do more things, is we're saying to them, is price stability that important? Is something else not more important? Therefore, can you trade it off against that? And that's actually going to be a question you guys are going to have to answer over your lifetime and over your careers. Is price stability that important, or do you want central banks to do something else? And if you want them to do something else, have they got the instruments at their disposal to bring about the outcomes that you might want? Or should it be done somewhere else? My own answer will come to you in a minute or two, well, probably about 30 minutes. So just bear with me. I'll try to get there on time. Otherwise, Tim will do something terrible to me. So let me start with a reminder of where we currently are. You would have heard a lot of comment in the press and in the media about the cost of living crisis. This is essentially the view that inflation has got out of control. Inflation is the annual increase in an everyday basket of goods and services, which is measured. And you'll know that the target for CPI inflation, that's the consumer price index, is 2% a year. So what you want is the Monetary Policy Committee to control its instruments and the behavior of the financial markets and individuals in the economy so they plan and operate as though the 2% norm will obtain. We think that's broadly consistent with price stability. But what we're seeing is, depending on your interpretation, a loss of price stability, a temporary failure to control the inflation rate, or a set of temporary shocks that we're accepting because the alternative would be a much larger contraction in activity than we might want optimally. So there's a kind of number of different interpretations as to what is going on. I'm not going to throw any particular interpretation down you. I'm simply saying that we're facing a cost of living crisis, of which the manifestation is an inflation rate far above the norm. And it's called a cost of living crisis because these inflation shocks are concentrated in food, energy prices, heating prices. And we know that poorer households spend a larger fraction of their disposable income on these items than more well-off households. So a given increase in those prices affects the well-being of those households much more than it does more well-off households. So this shock, although it's an aggregate shock to inflation, has really profound distributional consequences and is leading to this so-called cost of living crisis. And what we're simply showing there is the kind of way that that view is ratcheted up. Even if you look at the February, the green line here is the central case. In economics, we don't believe our forecasts. What we believe is the distribution of our forecasts, knowing there's a lot of risk to them. But the central line in February had a temporary peak of around 6% or so. The Bank of England's May report had a peak of 10%, but you can see it coming down by about 24, 25. There's risk around it, which are those error bands. And NISA's sort of view, which is contemporaneous to the bank uses NISA's models as well, is a very similar story of a huge overshoot. 10% inflation is not something we've seen for 40 years. The previous peak towards 10% was in 1990, so these are numbers well outside of the recent cohort. And the question we're all facing is, how do we get inflation down? Will inflation come down, and what do central banks have to do about it? And does this all mean they've lost control of the price level? What we can see is that, given the projections, it does look like by the middle of this decade, given the projections, we're going to return to price stability of around 2%. But that's not clear. The question for you is, what set of policy interventions are consistent with the path there? Because in there somewhere is something that must be happening to policy at the same time. This is not, as economists would call, exogenous or just given from God. It's not the word of God. It's got to be something that's conditioned on an intervention. So what level of interventions are required? And the second question you should ask yourself is, do we believe these models? If they're all based upon the last 30 years of data where inflation has been very stable and not persistent, by which I mean when it gets shocked, it comes very quickly back to target, maybe this is underestimating the risk that we're facing. And the policymakers have to respond in a very different way. Again, I'm not here to give you the answer today. I'm simply trying to set the context for the problem that we're currently facing, and we're going to take a step back and try to understand how we arrived at where we are. Is that clear with everyone? Thank you. So, let me also give you a bit of a poser before we go on to the main part of the lecture. I was interested to read a little bit about Reading before coming here. It's still a town, tries to be a city, hasn't got there yet. I hope it will one day. But it was famous for the 4 Bs, beer, bulbs, biscuits and bricks in the post-war period. And I have a little poser for you and ask the question at the end to see if you know what the answer is. Out of each of those 4 categories actually have an important role in economics. And I'll tell you why in each case at the end of the lecture. But I think only one of those would be any good as a currency. I'm not asking you for an answer now, but at the end of the lecture I'll see if people have got a view as to which one would be best as a currency. Just have that in the back of your mind while you listen to the rest of the lecture. I'll be seeing which one do you think would make a good currency. We'll see. So, here are some questions I'll try and answer in the rest of this lecture. Why do we move away from a commodity-backed currency? I've started to give you an answer to that, but I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Next question is, what have central banks learned about short-run demand management over the post-war period? What can they do? What can't they do? How should they manage it? We're going to go through some exercises there where it was first an engineering problem, and then, and most recently, it's become a game, this management. It's not something that can be thought of as a simple point on a trade-off that they choose. It's actually a game you're playing with agents to try to get them to believe what you want them to believe and behave in the way that you would like them to behave. It's much more complicated than simply setting down a plan and responding to it. And the final question we just ask ourselves is, do we need to adopt a different monetary policy objective? I think I've already hinted at my answer to you, but it's an important question for your generation to try and answer for the central bank. What do we want them to be doing when they get together every month and control the rate of borrowing in the economy and aim to control the financial system? What exactly do we ask of them? Because they're operating ultimately on our behalf. They're not operating on their own. So what do we want them to do? It's an incredibly important question for us all to try and contribute to, if we can. So let me show the progression of the UK economy over the last 300 years or so. Now the data, of course, has mostly been compiled after the event and is incredibly noisy, and therefore you shouldn't take it at face value, but a lot of people have another shilling in the meter, please. But it gives you an idea of this is a measure of GDP, so the total output in the economy in real terms, year by year, over that very long run period. The vertical lines that you're seeing, the shaded vertical lines, are recessions or contractions in activity. But you can see beyond the recessions, there's an upward slope to this line. It means, on average, for the last 300 years, the British activity in the British economy has been growing by around 1 to 1.25% per year. It means that every year we're getting 1% richer than we were before. And indeed, if we take the numbers at face value, there's output per head in around 1700 was around £1,600 in today's term. And output per head at the moment, of course, it's very volatile because of COVID. We can say approximately is around £30,000 a head. It gives you an idea of how much better off we are as an individual. So a random person born 300 years ago would have had a small fraction of the income that they have today. So we are better off. So don't sort of mistake the guidance about changes year on year with the overall level of income consumption, or more broadly speaking, the standard of living that we have. It's enormously better off. I would rather be alive today than I would at any point in the last 300 years if I were going to be randomly asked and randomly placed in a different part of the distribution. I would absolutely rather be alive today. That's what these numbers are telling me. I'm telling you the recessions that come along very regularly, but I want to tell you as well is that classically, we don't think monetary policy affects this long-run path at all. Changing the quantity of money, changing interest rates only provides impulses that affect the economy over the very short run. Because in the end, the price level adjusts to whatever nominal quantity of money we have in the system, and the real interest rate is something that is not determined by monetary policy. It's something that is a result of tastes, preferences, towards saving and the amount of capital available. It's not something that the monetary policy makers are setting. So monetary policy is not responsible for this very long run pattern. What monetary policy is about trying to stabilize variations around this and say to themselves, look, the economy is going to grow. There will be impulses that are driving the economy to a higher level of activity, but while that impulse is working its way through, we would like the economy not to go through some undue fluctuations because people don't know what the price level is. And what I mean by that is if I don't know what the price level is, I may be setting the wrong real wage. I may not be investing to the right amount because I don't know exactly what the real revenue is from any investment that I undertake. So as a result, there'll be extra volatility in the business cycle if I get the overall price level wrong. And that's really what monetary policy is all about. None of the above. None of what we're seeing in this chart here. And so one way to think about what monetary policy is about is really the inflation rate. Inflation rate is something that we think results or is closely tied to this notion of inefficient fluctuations in the economy where demand, aggregate demand is out of kilter with aggregate supply that tends to put upward or downward pressure on inflation as prices are adjusting to a different level of activity. And here's a very long run chart of the inflation rate. The dotted line is inflation, and the thicker line is bank rate or the policy rate. And take a broad period from 1700, 1717 that Isaac Newton, as master of the mint, set the price of gold in terms of sterling, he actually got his calculations wrong. So, don't let a scientist set monetary policy, very important. And he undervalued silver, which then led silver to just leaving the country altogether because it was more highly valued in Europe. But the point was, even that mistake didn't matter, because prices in the long run adjusted to this mistake about the calculation of the gold price. And that gold standard price was maintained from 1717 all the way through to 1931. Incredible. Of course, funny enough, I've not thought about this before. His theories on gravity actually lasted for about the same time as Einstein's writing in the early 20th century. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, so over this very long period, we have a gold standard, a price level target, and it may not be possible to see it exactly, but what we have over that long period is an average inflation rate of 0. There was no upward drift in inflation over this very long run. But what we can see, and other studies have suggested, that this maintenance of a price level over this very long period may have meant the average inflation rate was 0, but meant there was a lot of year-to-year volatility and activity. Because you were always trying to get the price level back to wherever it had moved in the previous year very, very quickly. So what you can see is a very, very volatile short-run movements in inflation, which we think today would be costly in terms of trying to understand where wages should be, how much money we need to save, and how we'd plan if the economy is more volatile. What we don't like is unanticipated volatility in planning. And we can see that as we move on, there's a spike in inflation during World War I, and after 1931, when we finally went off the gold standard, what you can then begin to see is inflation started to take off, become persistent in the language of economists. It didn't average at 0 anymore. When it rose, it continued to rise and took a long time to come back to levels that we think are consistent with price stability, which was really something that happened as late as the 1990s. And what you can also see from this chart, and this is why many people think that current bank rate is abnormally low at near 0, is that over the very long run, bank rate has been around 4%. It's the appropriate level of policy to deal with a real interest rate that equalizes savings and investment, as well as an inflation rate that we think, on average, is something consistent with price stability. So we have a very unusual set of circumstances at the moment where bank rate has been below inflation for quite some time. So, to summarize, we have a world in which we started with commodity money that had very volatile inflation rates and volatile business cycles. We then had a long period in which, well, having exited the gold standard, we hadn't found a nominal anchor, a way of not only adopting a regime for price stability, but convincing people in the economy we had such a regime, so they planned on that basis. It's a coordination issue. They ensure that you're not only trying to hit a particular target consistent with price stability, but everyone in the economy also thinks you are and believes you're credible in your wish to hit it, so that they also plan on that basis. That makes the whole problem a lot easier, because you're trying to hit the same equilibrium. And that was something we achieved in the latter part of the 20th century and through a large part of this century so far. Excuse me, I'll take a quick sip. But the problem we have often is we don't really know in real time, if we're going to take responsibility for controlling the economy, we don't really know in real time what's happening to the economy. It may be clear a year or two later, but when you're actually deciding what to do, you don't know what's happening. So you're constantly dealing with the shortages in information that you have. You don't know what's happening. It takes you time to understand what's happening. And then when you do respond, there's some time before it has an impact on the economy. This is the classic identification problem that any economic policymaker has. What is happening? What should we do? Even if we do something, how long will it take to have an impact? Could it be that by the time it has an impact, the thing we were trying to deal with has gone away? So this is a problem that will emerge time and time again when we start thinking about economic policy. So I've simply drawn a chart here of the interwar periods. I believe is now called the trans-war period. That's how language changes. I knew it as the interwar period, it's now called the trans-war period, between World War I and World War II. And I'm simply showing here the path of bank rate and the level of output in the economy. You can see as we left World War I, 1919, bank rate is around 6%. There's a recession because you can see output heading to the left. And then you can see in the 20s, what Pigou called a period of doldrums. The economy didn't really take off very much because it only recovered its 1919 level of activity well into the 1920s. 1929, we can see again, so-called year, well, not so-called, it was the year of the Wall Street crash. And many people talk about there being a Great Depression. Let me be clear, there was no Great Depression in the UK. Activity grew through the 1930s, which is what you can see in the line going from 1939 back to 1932, or 1932 to 1939. The economy did grow, and one of the reasons that it grew during the 1930s is in 1931 we left the gold standard, had a large depreciation in the currency, which meant that we could continue to export against the rest of the world, and that supported activity in the economy. Often come across people who think there was a Great Depression in the UK. There wasn't. I'm afraid that's a few thousand miles to the west where there was a Great Depression. But what we're trying to understand is looking at this chart, what were the shocks driving the economy at the time? Because in order to understand what the appropriate policy is, we need to understand what shocks were driving the economy. Were these shocks from monetary policy, or were these shocks from a lack of spending in the economy caused by a lack of confidence, or a change in the economy from a war economy to a non-war economy, or a collapse in our export markets or something? So it goes back to my point. In order to understand how to respond, we need to understand what the shocks are. And so it's actually possible to use data that was constructed many, many years after these events. This data that we've now got available to us has largely been constructed in the last quarter of the 20th century, some 50 years after the event. So we've got much more information available to us than the policymakers at the time had. And when we look at the output pattern of the early 1920s, there's a huge recession in the early 1920s and a return to activity by 1924. And the deep question in this period has always been what caused that recession at that time? What was the mistake that was carried out? Was it something to do with the pattern of expenditure, or was it in some way caused by monetary policy? And there are papers now out there trying to understand what was happening at the time. And what people do is trying to understand whether the shock that was hitting the economy emanated from the money markets or from spending, so-called IS and LM. I'm not going to go through IS and LM now, but just understand that it could be spending or it could be from money markets. And it looks like that recession was largely caused by negative shocks in money markets. In other words, monetary policy was too tight. We were not allowing money to expand in the way we wanted to. And there's good narrative evidence that supports that. Because what you may not know is that at least de facto, the country was off the gold standard until 1925, and was a push to return to the gold standard. But prices after World War I were higher than they were overseas, which meant that in order to return to the gold standard, we have to have a deflation. Prices had to fall in this country. So just imagine a world in which prices are too high. You want to go back to the gold standard, prices have to fall again. In order to do that, you need demand and supply to reverse themselves. Demand has to be lower and prices can fall, and then you can go back on the old exchange rate. So the story is that monetary policy was too tight. And of course, was Churchill famously took us back onto the gold standard in 1925, and it didn't last because it was just too tight for the export markets that the country was facing, didn't allow growth in the way it would otherwise have done, and by 1931, the UK finally left the gold standard. So what is the point in this historical story? Well, it's simply to say from that, and of course, policymakers immediately after World War II didn't have this data, but the data is consistent with the narrative at the time. Keynes famously wrote that we shouldn't go back at the gold standard at that price, and he did some calculations to suggest that it was an overvalued exchange rate. And this analysis, modern analysis that we have, seems to suggest the same thing. So it tells us that if you get monetary policy wrong, you can induce fluctuations in the economy that you needn't have. You're inducing volatility that you'd want to avoid if you could by having a better policy in place. And it's also telling you that a fixed exchange rate may not be providing the appropriate interest rate that you need for domestic conditions. And this was, of course, a lesson we learnt again in 1992 when the UK fell out of the exchange rate mechanism, having had an exchange rate that was too high for domestic conditions, that would have required bank rate to be much higher than we needed at that time. So again, the lesson to learn is monetary policy matters, because if you get it wrong, you can do a lot of harm. So what did we then learn? Well, the Keynesian Revolution, really the idea that impulses in the economy, in this case I've called them G, can have a much larger impact on output than the original impulse. So if I spend some money from wherever it comes autonomously, that money will be spent by other people as well and may create an amplification of the original amount of expenditure. So I could move the economy from the point on the left to the point on the right, but also in reverse. If I start to remove money from the economy, I can also amplify a downswing. We learned from the Keynesian Revolution, there's not only one equilibrium the economy can have. There can be lots of equilibria that depend upon the level of demand or output in the economy. And the government can have a direct role in affecting that by changing the level of output and deciding the appropriate level of intervention, whether it's through government expenditure or interest rates. And it can amplify the fluctuations if it wants to and create more activity. But again, if it gets it wrong, it can also amplify the fluctuations in the wrong way. So it places a huge responsibility on government to get this right. If we think in the short run the economy will not settle at its full employment equilibrium without support from the government, if it's going to take too long for us to adjust, the government can get involved and produce a better outcome than would otherwise be the case. This is the heart of the Keynesian Revolution. That's why we still remember the name of Keynes. Gave us these ideas that something better could be done. But whether you can actually do it requires a huge information set that we discovered later on may not be fully available to policymakers. In that world, it may be just as likely that policy makes mistakes, amplifies the cycle, wasn't me, was it, rather than attenuate the cycle. Final part of that jigsaw was then to understand what it is we're trying to trade off against each other. So we can intervene, and how do we intervene? Well, this is a famous paper by A.W. Phillips, the Phillips curve, which sort of said, well, what we could do in principle is use something like unemployment as a gauge. Is the microphone still running? I can't hear it. Use the microphone, not the microphone. Don't use the microphone. Leave the microphone alone. That there may be a trade-off in the economy that we may want to pick. We may want to decide whether we want employment or inflation. And the idea that there's a trade-off between employment and inflation, or activity and inflation, was a result of an empirical piece of work by Phillips, who looked at the relationship using data largely supplied by William Beveridge, looking at the relationship between unemployment and the rate of change in wages over successive periods. So he looked at this 52-year period and then cranked it forward to see whether the relationship still held in subsequent periods, and he found that it was. And it seemed to suggest there was a menu of interventions, that if we thought unemployment was too high, we could intervene with government intervention through either government expenditure or lower interest rates and reduce the unemployment rate at the cost of a little bit more inflation, if that's what we wanted to do. So it told you that the interventions were not costless, but it told you what the trade-off was. And you could decide where on the trade-off you wanted to sit. Do you want to sit at the point where there's very little unemployment with high inflation, which is maybe where you want to sit before an election? Or do you want to sit at a point with high levels of unemployment and low levels of inflation or rates of changes in wages? So it meant that the government intervention could be thought of as something that had a price attached to it, and then gave us some menu of options. Then, of course, you could decide how gradually or how much you responded to a particular shock. So this is an incredibly important finding. We still talk about a Phillips curve today in economics as this short-run trade-off between activity and inflation. And so we move on. So the next part of the story is, let's just recap. We've learnt that if we can, we want to control the economy. We've learnt that it's difficult, but we've also learnt that if we can intervene, we can affect outcomes in an important way. But we've also learnt there's a cost to them. So now let's think about what instruments we have at our disposal. And we move on from Phillips, later on to the work of Tinbergen, who one of the first recipients of the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences, into the counting principle. And that says, look, if I have a target for inflation output, if they're both at their target, that's called the Bliss point in economics. And you can see that if we've got the same weights on deviations of inflation output from this Bliss point, there'll be a set of concentric circles. So each of those concentric circles represent the same distance away from the Bliss point. And therefore, you wouldn't mind being on any of those points. But every concentric circle that's further out is one that you like less than the one that's nearer in, because it's nearer your Bliss point. So you could just think of this as a set of indifference curves around a particular target. And because you've got two targets you're going to shoot for, the indifference curves become indifference circles. So our Bliss point is where we're trying to aim towards. But if we're at this cross here to the top right, and inflation is high and output is unsustainably high, we're in the middle of a boom and we want to offset it, what we learnt was that if we want to control both of outputs and inflation, we're going to need two independent instruments to deal with it. We're not going to have just one instrument that can move us from the X to the Bliss point. The idea is to have two independent instruments, one that could reduce inflation and one that could get output back to something that wasn't a boom. And these have to be independent instruments, by which we mean the instrument that affects inflation should not be something that's also affecting output. Otherwise, we're going to have to change what we want from output. The more that they infect each other, the harder it's going to be to control this economy to get it to where you want to be. So, we have a cost of interventions in the economy, and we now know that in order to meet more than one objective, we're going to need more than one instrument. And we can use this idea repeatedly in economics. We need two instruments for two objectives, and etc. But they need to be independent instruments, ones that don't make the efficiency of the other instrument more problematic. It's got to be something that doesn't infect it, in other words. And then there's another problem. Not only do we need instruments, we need to know whether the Bliss point is indeed feasible. This line, this Phillips curve, became a depiction of the economy. It's the constraint that we can't cross. It tells us what we can do and what we can't do. So in this world, if we take the Phillips curve relationship seriously between inflation and unemployment, we can't do better than the top blob. That is our constraint that we're hitting. So we can forget about the Bliss point altogether, because the Phillips curve says we can't get there. We cannot get to a lower level of unemployment and a lower level of inflation than the constraint itself applies. So we have to accept a second best in the presence of constraints. And this is often a problem that emerges in any area of economic policy. You'd want to get to the best, but it's not feasible. It's outside or beyond the constraint that I'm working towards. So I have to settle for something else, less good than that, and then I have to articulate to people why. I have to adopt some transparency and some accountability to say why I can't get to the Bliss point. It's the structure of the economy that I have, or the instruments at my disposal, or the information set that is available to me, why I can't deliver everything that you might want me to. And then it's up to you to decide whether you believe it or not. Because you may say, actually, I think you can do better than that. And of course, a lot of the reforms that we're talking about in the economy are on the so-called supply side of the economy, all that real stuff we looked at over on, which should all be about moving this Phillips curve to the left if you can. That's really where to think about the supply side stuff in the economy. I just have another sip of water if I may. And unfortunately, there's another problem. It's all problems in this world. Here, all I'm doing is trying to hit an inflation target. I'm just going to come across here if I may. And my inflation target is there. And I find myself at this point here. Even if I have the correct instrument to get inflation to the target, I may not exactly know how that instrument will affect inflation. And that might be because I don't know the structure of the economy, or I can't identify the shock. But if by changing interest rates, I don't exactly know what the impact will be on inflation, I've introduced, unfortunately, another trade-off with inflation variance. Because by moving the interest rate and not fully understanding its impact, I've introduced even more uncertainty into the economy. So I've introduced yet another trade-off in that I don't like inflation variance and I don't like inflation. I want to hit my target, but if this inflation variance matters, the best I can do, or what I ought to be doing, is aiming for B rather than C. I could use interest rates, I could raise them or cut them, whichever way you want to. In this case, I'm below target, so I'll be wanting to cut interest rates. I could cut interest rates a lot, try to get to C, but because I'm not quite sure how that's going to impact on the economy, and I'm worried about inflation variance, remember I was saying it might affect the distribution in a particular way, I might want to prepare or accept an undershoot in inflation at B, because I'd rather that than go to C. Even though I'm hitting my target here, I'm creating so much inflation variance, I'd rather be here. And then I have to explain. I have to go back. Where's the governor? Here. I have to go back to the person who asked me to hit the inflation target and say, look, I'm going to have to undershoot for a while because if I cut interest rates by even more, I'm not quite sure what the impact is going to be. And of course, you can reverse that argument for now. If inflation is over its target and is escalating, you might think intuitively interest rates have to go up a lot, but you might say to yourself, I'm not quite sure what the impact will be after COVID, in the middle of a war, in an energy and price shock of raising interest rates to 3 or 4%, that would get inflation back to target more quickly. And because I'm not sure exactly what the impact will be in a world which is heavily indebted, household debt is some 120% of disposable income, public debt is 100% of GDP, maybe I should accept a bit of an overshoot for a while and not raise interest rates by enough. So I hope your head is spinning, because mine is. There's a lot of things to think about here. Okay, so far, let me summarize, and I'll be, I think I'm on time, Tim. I think it's all on time, just to be clear. I'll take another sip if I may. This is only water, unfortunately. So, where are we now with the theory of monetary policy? Well, central bankers have accepted the challenge to control the short-term fluctuations in the economy through the use of interest rates to try and minimize inefficient fluctuations in economic activity. Gosh, that's a long sentence. But they've accepted the challenge as a result of all the things I've been talking about. But what has to be done? Well, we have to remember that the target has to be defined. The target shouldn't be defined by the person who's been asked to pursue it. That should be designed by society. It should be a social choice. The politicians are making that choice. So in that world, it's still entirely appropriate with democracy for an expert to be pursuing that target because they've been mandated by society through the actions of a politician. We need to remember there are really important trade-offs here. Trade-offs at any one moment between activity and output. Trade-offs in terms of the use of different instruments, and trade-offs as well in terms of the level of uncertainty we have about how our instruments may work, which may require us or suggest that we miss our target for a while. So at any moment in time, there may be an active choice to miss a target, and then that requires, we think, explanation as to why, so that the credibility is not lost. Because if credibility is lost, everyone will start to plan around a different inflation target, which will then mean we have to have a recession or a boom in order to get inflation back on track. So credibility is very important in the middle of all of this. We talked about the constraints. The constraints are informational and economic structural constraints, all of which will limit the room for maneuver of the policymaker and also their ambition, given any set of shocks. And we've talked about uncertainty, the where, the how, and the impact is always and everywhere a problem. And we learnt this morning we're under the ultimate constraint as well of time. We have to operate within a certain amount of time in terms of what we do. We can't wait for all the information to come in before we act, because tomorrow there'll be another shock and another need to respond. So where does this all leave us, this mess of a limit to the extent to which we can write this down as an engineering problem? Actually, it means we need to play some games. We need to sort of get people to believe we will carry out the things that we've told them we'd carry out. And we need to also understand that people are smart. That if we pay particular rules with them, they will learn the rules and try to minimize the cost to them. And I'll try to give you an example shortly. And there's even a further set of problems. What if that Phillips curve I've written down is not right? What if it changes? What if it manifests itself in a different way? What if we don't understand the economy? What if the economy has changed? What if we're not an economy that makes biscuits, bulbs, beer and bricks? What if we're an economy that is kind of doing a lot of financial engineering or IT engineering? Does the structure of the economy mean that we don't understand it well enough to respond to? These are the questions we have to deal with all the time. And what happens if we're credible or if we're not credible? How does that then complicate? And how do we establish credibility? How do we get people to believe that we are going to continue to pursue an inflation target when inflation is 5, 6, 7, 8%? Let's start with the Lucas critique. So one of the things that became very clear in the 1970s is that that menu of trade-offs was not stable. Whenever we tried to get inflation down by changing unemployment, it didn't have the impact that we thought it was going to have. It looked like agents were learning the rules. And there are a couple of very famous statements of this. One by Charles Goodhart, so Goodhart's law, which says that as soon as you try to target something, the behavior underlying that target changes, which means that that target no longer has information for what you're trying to achieve. And in a similar vein, the Lucas critique was making a similar point, in that if we estimate relationships econometrically, and then we try to exploit them for policy purposes, those relationships will change because people will condition their responses on the policy response as well as the actual structural relationships in place. And that makes it very hard. And I think one way to illustrate this is to imagine that the policymaker is a goalkeeper in a penalty shootout. And the policymaker is saying to herself, I've got to save this penalty, otherwise we're going to lose in the final against Italy. I'm sure it never happened. Anyway, so what I need to do is save this penalty. And I know that number 17 has got a particular way of taking penalties. So I'm going to ring up my friends at the University of Reading, and I'm going to say, hang on a minute, can you tell me where number 17 always puts her penalties? Really important. So James gets on the computer, and he looks it up, and he finds out that 95% of the time, number 17 puts the ball to her right. James sends the results back to the goalie because he wants England to win a tournament in his lifetime. And he sends the results back to the goalie, and he says, look, go left. That number 17, she always goes to her right. You go left, you'll save the penalty, England will finally win a tournament. And the goalkeeper, who's the central banker in this setup, says, okay, we've got the econometric evidence. I know that number 17 is going to go to my left. I'm going to dive to the left. I'm going to save the goal and win. Do you know what happens? Unfortunately, number 17 has done a course in economics from Tim Besley and knows very well that that data is out there, that she always goes to the right. She also knows that the goalkeeper has got that data available to her, and she's going to dive to her left. So she changes her behavior, shoots to the left, England lose the final. This is the heart of the economic policy critique. As soon as we start to learn that interventions will be made in a particular way, we will start to change our behavior and anticipate those interventions. That is why the econometric evidence that we had about the Phillips curve became increasingly hard to exploit. It was known that there would be looser money in a time when unemployment was low, so people just asked for higher wages. That then stopped that having any impact on unemployment. It just led to higher levels of wages. And this is fundamentally the problem here. Now, of course, you could go further. You could say, well, the goalie knows that number 17 knows, so she actually dives the other way and saves it. But then you could go even further and say, well, number 17 knows that the goalie knows that she knows, so she continues to go to the right. In fact, the answer to that is just to randomize in the end. But let's not go that far. I'm simply trying to illustrate that if we get econometric evidence, somebody may have an incentive to change their behavior as a result of the action that that individual will undertake. Lost my clicker. Oh, there it is. Okay. Another problem is we don't understand the economy. The words here, forwards, backwards, and hybrid, simply mean if agents are forward-looking, backward-looking, or the economy is inhabited by a set of people who are both forward and backward-looking, so-called hybrid model. So I've got 3 different types of Phillips curves where people are forward-looking, backward-looking, or hybrid, and I've got 3 different policymakers, Schultz, Chatelain, and Clegg. These are all people actually I was in graduate school with, 3 different names. They don't know that yet, but I call them that. And if Schultz is a policymaker, and the true Phillips curve is in fact forward-looking, then Schultz will be the winner. If the true Phillips curve is backwards-looking, and Chatelain, who worked for a long time in the Banque de France, anyway, I shouldn't embarrass him anymore, very nice guy. Chatelain thinks it's backward-looking, and he operates that way, then he'll be the winner. If Clegg, and that's not Nick Clegg, by the way, it's someone else called Clegg. If Clegg thinks it's hybrid, there's some combination of the two, and it turns out to be hybrid, then Clegg will be the winner. But actually, none of them know the truth. So the question then is, on top of that, if you could choose which one to be, which one would you be if you weren't determined to have set preferences about the state of the economy? Because when you're working in a central bank, somebody can come to you with some estimates and say, look, I think this is the parametric estimation. And you could believe them and use that for your policy analysis. And in that world, you'd be one of Schultz, Chatelain, or Clegg. But on top of that, you may say, well, whatever you say, it may not be that. So which should I choose to minimize my chance of being wrong? How do I minimize my chance of the worst outcome? Well, you can see, if you're Clegg and you take the hybrid approach, you'll never be bottom. So the rational choice is to be eclectic. To say, well, whatever model of the economy you write down, I'm not going to believe it. I'm going to take a convex combination of the models, or a combination of them, and work on that basis. And then the problem is, I don't know what the parameters are as a result of that, and I'm always guessing what the structure of the economy is. So that one trade-off I suggested is in fact very blurred, because it's an adding up of many, many models that again makes the choice very hard in the short run. And if there's no credibility, you can see the game the private sector is playing with the central bank. And the central bank wants a low inflation, and the private sector may want a low inflation. And if they both played low inflation, you'd be in a bliss point, because inflation would be low and employment would be high. But the private sector here has an incentive to deviate, because if it thinks the central bank's going low, and it plans on a high inflation, that will lead to a high level of output, and the private sector will be happy. Equally, if the private sector imagines there's going to be a low level of inflation, the central bank says, well, no, I can inflate away here. That could lead to a low level of output. So the problem you've got is that the bliss point, where they both go low, is not stable. Both agents have an incentive to go high here. And so what you get is an inflation bias. Unless you both are convincing each other that you're serious about a low level of inflation, this kind of game will lead to an inflation bias. And the question there is an inflation bias re-emerging in any way at the moment? And I have about 2 or 3 more minutes to go, Tim. So we want to respond to that concern of an inflation bias, that concern that it's a really complicated game out there, by having an institutional design in place. And that's where the Monetary Policy Committee of the bank came in, reflecting a social consensus of price stability, mandated by the body politic, and something which is carried out by experts under the mandate of democratically elected officials. And this is a plot of expected interest rates the trading day before central bank independence was announced, and the day at the end of the first day when central bank independence was announced. And what you can see is a large shift down in expected interest rates over the next 20 years. So this is 1997. These are expected interest rates for the next 20 years, taking us through to 2017. You see on the simple announcement of central bank independence, interest rates across the board were expected to fall. And that's in direct contrast to many people's expectations, that thinking if you make a central bank independent, they're more likely to have higher interest rates than a central bank that's under control of politicians. In fact, it's the other way around. Because they're controlling inflation better, we anticipate inflation to be lower. In other words, this is a demonstration of the elimination of the inflation bias that I was talking about a minute ago. Rather than there being a sense in which people are going to be gaming the system to try and get a better outcome, and if they're doing it on both sides, we end up with a higher level of inflation. It was actually said, no, these guys are credible, inflation will be lower, and as a result, nominal interest rates have fallen. And that reduction in funding costs has saved us billions of pounds over the last 25 years. And indeed, we start to look at economic outcomes, they've also hugely improved. Simply here showing inflation and output in scatters in the post-war period. This is for when we have well-constructed UK data. I can go back further. 56 to 70, 71 to 92. 56-70 is broadly the Bretton Woods period of fixed but floating exchange rates. Actually ended in 71. 71 to 92 takes us through that period where we were trying to chase a nominal anchor through incomes and wages policy, monetary targetry, shadowing the Deutschmark and the ERM. You can see that you can immediately see that's a much worse performance. And then you have this kind of what I've called in a book the long expansion period from after the ERM crisis all the way up through to the great financial crisis or the global financial crisis. You get this beautifully behaved set of inflation output outcomes for which I think the Monetary Policy Committee and the Bank of England should take some credit. But this subsequent period in which we've had much more volatility, I think is a question that is now leading, an issue that's now leading some questions as to, do we have to redesign the framework? But I think it's worth pointing to the success of the regime in that 24 or 25 year period. So my summary. We've had commodity standards for most of the time that we've had monetary economics. Non-monetary standards, or non-commodity standards rather, have been a very rare phenomenon. We've only had half a century or so of them. But it became increasingly clear they were too volatile and we could do better. As the 20th century proceeded, it's increasing democratic mandate to improve or stabilize living standards. And monetary policy was contained within that mandate. There was an attempt in the post-war period to try and use standard control techniques of engineering, but those standard control techniques don't deal very well with human society, expectations, and our ability to learn. So we had to try and adopt some different forms of rules because people play games. And so what we had to learn was how to manage expectations and think through institutional structures and commitment technologies, things that we would believe would continue to deliver low and stable levels of inflation. And all of this was designed to guarantee the public good of money. Now, as I wind up, let me go back to the first question, or one of the questions I asked earlier on. Having listened to all of that, are there any of these that you would choose for a currency? Beer, bulbs, biscuits, or bricks? Bricks. Well done, exactly the right answer. The nearest would be bricks. They're nearest to gold. the nearest about things we could attach a certain standard and weight to. The others just wouldn't work. But they all have an important role in economic history. When Beveridge was first constructing his price indices using the prices of wheat and beer, often from educational establishments around the country, beer often had a very high weight in the price index. 6% is the most recent estimate from a paper by Clark. But actually, over the longer run, there were much higher weights of beer in these indices. So that's a useful thing. For those of you interested, do go and read up about the Tulip Bubble, Tulip Bubble of 1634-7, where tulip prices projected a bubble in Holland. It's worth reading about that. And rather than biscuits being used as currency, there are many examples of cigarettes being used as currency in prisoner of war camps. And it's a really interesting, famous paper by Radford, who had been a student at the LSE in the post-war period, going through his experience of the way cigarette prices went up and down in a prisoner of war camp. And it's a fascinating article. I think it's free to read in JSTOR. But of course the answer here is bricks. Thank you. So, what are my answers? Why do we move away from commodity-backed currency? We could do better. What have central banks learned about short-run demand management? It's hard. You've got to be careful what you do because you're just as likely to make mistakes as do the right thing. So there has to be a lot of care. And the key word here is gradualism and conservatism. And you're conservative and gradualist because you're not trying to improve society, you're trying to limit the downsides to society. And that's why you're approaching this in terms of the following phrase, to do no harm. And finally, do we need to adopt a different monetary policy objective? Well, my answer would be no, but why don't we have a discussion about that? Thank you all very, very much for listening this lunchtime.
Thank you very much, Jagjit. Wait a minute, I need to switch this on. Is that working now? Yeah, good. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have a Q&A session now. So those of you who'd like to ask a question of Jagjit or make a point are very welcome to do so. Because of the way we're doing the filming, I'm going to repeat the question into the microphone to make sure that those who get to watch this online will know what the question was that was asked. So, anybody like to set the ball rolling with a question over there?
What do you mean by the term instruments?
The question is, what do you mean by the term instruments?
Okay, directly I mean bank rate. So the use of this is the rate which traditionally banks paid, commercial banks paid to borrow from the Bank of England, but it's currently the rate at which their reserves that are lodged with the Bank of England are remunerated at. And this is the standard instrument used in monetary policy. Now, of course, since 2011, an additional instrument has been quantitative easing. And that's an attempt to influence long-term interest rates by buying and holding long-term government bonds. But that, in a sense, is a substitute because bank rate was so near zero, it couldn't be lowered any further. So the instruments we're talking about is really control of either short or long-term interest rates.
We have another question down here, and then I'll go there.
Okay, sure. So you said about kind of how it might need redesigning potentially or theoretically. My question is, if you had to redesign it, what corrections do you feel have to be made to suit economics nowadays?
Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, if you had to redesign the system, in what way would you do that?
It's a exceptionally good question, and one which lots of people are trying to think about. I think the first thing is a review that is long overdue. We haven't had a review of the monetary policy framework or objectives almost since inception. We've had a couple of examinations of the forecasting process and the nature of the decision making at the MPC. But I think it would be important to think about the Bank of England in the round. There is a financial policy committee as well as a prudential regulatory authority. These are committees that are thinking about financial conditions as well as monetary conditions at the monetary policy committee level. So I think there's a question about the decision-making structure, at the bank and the panoply of committees that we've got. On top of that, I think there needs to be some thought as to how the quantitative easing programme has evolved over time. It was originally thought of as a temporary intervention in financial markets. It's almost become a semi-permanent feature on the landscape now, and it's not clear exactly how we'll be exited from that. So almost related to the previous question about what would we do to move away from an instrument that we'd invented. And I think then there should also be some further work as to understanding whether the 2% inflation target is fit for purpose still. Is that something that we want? Do we want to move to a different form of target? Do we want to continue with the regime by which, if the inflation target is missed, there's simply a letter from the governor to the chancellor, or is there some other embarrassment cost, some other way of understanding that? So I think what I would say is it's time, after 25 years, for a review of it all. All that said, I do think the pursuit of an inflation target around 2% by a set of independent experts is a very good thing. Where I'd also want to see the committee reformed is to provide more resources for the independent members. I think too often there's consensus or even unanimity in voting, which seems unlikely given the scale of misunderstandings or lack of understanding that we have about the economy. I'd expect there to be many more disagreements than I'm seeing, which surprises me.
Can I just offer a supplemental?
Of course.
Some people might say, given we're at a point of peak inflation, at least in looking at the last 4 years, isn't now exactly the wrong time, though, to be having a review when it might be most difficult to convince people about the current system, or is now the best time to have a review?
It's interesting you say that. We were trying to work out the inflation dynamics that might happen as a result of inflation hitting 8 or 9 or 10%. It seemed to us unlikely that it would return very quickly back to 2%, because if you've been at 7 or 8%, as people start to wage bargain next year, it didn't seem to me be terribly clear that they would start to target 2%. So we may find a period in which inflation settles at something above target, and that could be the right time to have that review about whether we try to get back to 2% and how we do. And it seemed to me exactly at that point we'd have even more evidence as to why inflation was a bad thing. Even though this group clearly understand the problems and costs of inflation, I think we were concerned that people may have forgotten what a problem high inflation and volatile inflation is. But I would think in a year or so we would have enough evidence to reignite that debate, and that's probably would be the time to do it, I think.
Thank you. So there was a question at the back.
Yeah, just a bit of clarification, please. Earlier on you mentioned that average household debt is 120% of average household income. Using the figure you quoted, average household income £30,000, average household debt therefore £36,000. Does that include mortgages, or is it just unsecured debt?
Okay, so the question is, does your figure for household debt being 120% of household income include mortgages on that?
Firstly, that was real GDP ahead, not a nominal number. But when we look at household debt, that would be including mortgage debt as well. And if we go to household income, that'll be a different number to income per head, because the households are approximately 2.2 people. So you have to scale that number up to get the actual level of debt held by households in the economy. So I wouldn't compare the two strictly. So what we saw was a real number there, didn't account for the nominal change, and as well as that household income is more than individual income, and it does include mortgage debt ratio. Thank you for the question.
Again, a supplemental on that. How worried should the Monetary Policy Committee be now about household indebtedness when it's making its decisions about interest rates?
Well, clearly we're in a world where it is an issue, but I think the overall quantum of lending out there looks less risky than it was a generation or so ago. There's a much smaller fraction of people with very high loan-to-value ratios. It means that they can deal with higher levels of interest rates. I think that's one issue. By far and away, most mortgages are now on fixed terms rather than floating rates. Of course, they're not fixed forever, but it means that the pass-through is much slower than it was in the past. And that gives households some time to adjust to to higher interest rates. It's not an immediate shock to the balance sheet. So I think those two things together mean that it's not as problematic as it might first appear by raising interest rates. But of course, the correct response is to be gradual and see whether there's an increase in payments problems or bankruptcies or forced sales or repossessions. But there seems to be very little evidence of it at the moment, but that will be the thing to monitor. And that also goes back to the point about ensuring that the FPC and the MPC are perhaps slightly better coordinated than they might be at the moment, because there will be some financial data that would help us understand the impact of the set of interest rate responses that we might be seeing over the next few months.
Thank you. So I see a question at the front there.
Do you think that quantitative easing can increase already high liquidity by increasing stock prices, which can be helped by a lot of the individuals?
Okay, so the question is, do you think quantitative easing can increase inequality by its impact on stock prices or perhaps asset prices more generally?
So first, quantitative easing was a way to deal with the fact that the instrument bank rate was constrained at zero. The shocks from the global financial crisis were large enough that ideally you would have wanted interest rates to go negative. But people can always hold cash for which the interest rate is zero rather than holding bank deposits on which they'll get a negative interest rate. So you can't lower bank rate much more than a little bit negative. So quantitative easing was an attempt to try and deal with that, to the extent to which, given the size of the global financial crisis, we didn't end up with a much larger recession and a much higher level of unemployment. I think quantitative easing was initially a success. Now, most monetary policy interventions in history have been temporary interventions in the economy, so they have no real impact. Of course, what we've had is a decade of very low interest rates that has had some real distributional impacts. And it's reasonably clear from a number of studies that have been published, not only by central banks but outside central banks, that these low interest rates have escalated the financial wealth and housing wealth of those who were holding wealth at the time interest rates went low. So it's allowing those with the exuberant privilege of having been well off in 2008 or 9 to have done even better than they would have otherwise have done over the last decade. So I think the broad answer is that it has contributed to inequality, but that's not directly the central bank's fault. The central bank has been trying to keep up the level of nominal demand so that activity in the economy didn't fall and lead to levels of unemployment. If we think the level of wealth inequality is too high as a society, I'm afraid that's a job for the Treasury and the politicians to deal with, not with the central bank. So I realise that's quite a nuanced answer, but I hope it explains, I think, the right response to that question.
Okay, one there.
With technology advancing, don't you think that there should be like other institutes that have a better idea than the banks do?
Okay, so the question is, with technology advancing, shouldn't there be other institutions that have a better sense of what's going on than the central bank?
Yeah, the National Institute. Look, there are lots of people with different views. We need someone to take responsibility for monetary policy, and it's better that the central bank does it than any other institute I can think of. But where I think your answer is very well posed is that the question is, are those making decisions open enough to ideas and thoughts from outside of the communities in which they work and live? This is the idea of groupthink. Are they too insulated? Are they offering themselves up for the kind of robust questioning that I am at the moment? Are they a bit too isolated? And I think it's that flow of information from people who look at things in a slightly different way that is really important for these institutions to have in place. We had for a long time, I don't know whether we had it when you were on the NPC, we had a monetary policy roundtable at least twice a year, where NPC and other members would listen to presentations from people outside of the policy community about what was going on. And I think people learnt a lot about that, because if you're within a policy institution, a lot of what you read and learn about is filtered through officials. So you're not necessarily getting the whole picture. So I think it's more a case of opening up the information flows rather than asking someone else to do it. That's where I would want to go down that route. But you put your hand up. Did you want to follow up?
Yeah, but don't you think, like, for example, for laws and legislation, we open up to the public forum, don't you think that we should be allowed to get on, like, even just normal citizens' views on them?
Okay, so the question is, should we be opening this up and getting normal citizens' views as opposed to the abnormal citizens on the PC.
Look, democracy is a great thing, and learning from what people think is really important. There's a whole strand of economics now where we're trying to understand what people think in real time, either through social media or surveys or narratives, and this is providing a lot of information about confidence. A lot of it has forward-looking information for consumption patterns and house prices. And I think that's where we're doing the vox populi. That's where we're allowing people to speak through that. But I do believe, just as you would with a neurosurgeon, I'd rather a neurosurgeon operated on me if I had a problem, rather than a member of the public. So in that sense, to the extent to which these are technical matters over which judgment should be formed over a career, I would rather an expert were running it. But I would also rather an expert was listening to a wide range of views at the same time. I hope it doesn't sound too elitist.
I have a notice of
Yeah, do.
Why shouldn't we all just decide we're going to use Bitcoin and avoid having to worry about inflation in terms of pound and
So well, I don't begin to understand what underpins the value of Bitcoin. I do know what underpins the value of a central bank is over 300 years of reputation and the ultimate ability of the state to raise taxes. Bitcoin's value can fluctuate enormously from day to day. If you're prepared to put up with that and possibly work in that sector, then that's fine with you, but it's not something I feel comfortable with.
Okay, probably have time for one more question if there is one. One down the front here.
In this situation where we have a great inflation, doesn't monetary easing and this is worse, or we have to change.
So the concern is one around hyperinflation. Does fiscal and monetary policy does it make things worse?
Yeah. Well, I think we'll find that hyperinflations are a result of monetary and fiscal policy having got out of control. Typically, it's a result of a state that cannot raise taxes anymore and has asked the central bank to finance its expenditures directly. To be clear, that's not what QE was. QE was nothing like that at all. This was the repurchase of debt that had already been sold to the non-bank financial sector. So hyperinflation is really a consequence of a bankrupt state, and how you stop a hyperinflation is to completely reform the monetary fiscal regime, reform it, and ensure that moving on, that liabilities will be backed by taxes. It means whole-scale reform of central banks and the fiscal authorities. It's what we saw in Eastern Europe in the 1920s and in other examples of hyperinflation. So hyperinflation itself is a failure of the state and can only be solved by the rebirth of that failed state. I don't know if you've got a particular country in mind at the moment, but there is chronic inflation in a number of places, but I don't think they're yet hyperinflation.
Okay, I think with that I'm going to draw matters to a close and thank Jagjit for a very informative and interesting lecture, which I hope you've all enjoyed. I'd like to thank you for coming and spending the day here at Reading, and hopefully has inspired you as a future economist. Maybe one of you will be sitting on this stage. Jagjit
I hope so.
reminded us that he'd been to a lecture at AJT which had inspired him. So we look forward in years to come to perhaps meeting some of you who are going to become professional economists. Thanks to Reading for hosting this. It's been a wonderful day, and we've benefited greatly from the hospitality of the Reading economy.